So remember last week we worked on brainstorming ideas for fairy tales. Some of you began writing your fairy tale, which is great. So we're going to work on today establishing that situation, how we introduce characters using dialogue, descriptions, and providing a sense of closure. That's what we're going to be focusing on this week. So today though, we're just going to be focusing on establishing or making that situation known and who our characters are. So if you remember in my example, mine was about a young boy named Peter and about how he wants to become a prince and he drinks some milk from this magical cow, and then he finds out later on he really doesn't want to be a prince. So at the beginning of my fairy tale, I need to introduce my main character and establish the situation. What's going to happen in this story? So the beginning of my fairy tale will answer important questions for the reader. Who is the story about? Where does the story take place? What problem or challenges does the main character face? Today, I'm going to model for you how I introduce my main character and how I establish a setting. So this was my planning guide from last week, and this is my example, my example text that I have for us. So remember, all fairy tales, they start with the phrase, once upon a time. Or at least for our purpose, that's what they're all going to start with. So once upon a time, a young boy named Peter, and I copied a little weird, so I'm going to just fix that for us. And I guess I'll make it a little bigger as well. Once upon a time, a young boy named Peter lived with his parents on a small farm a few miles away from the king's castle. His parents were kind and hardworking. Peter loved his parents and helped him as much as he could, but the family was poor and life was difficult. So notice, I have my Peter character, I have my parents, I introduced the idea of royalty in there, I let them know that his parents are hardworking and honest, and I'm getting the idea that there's going to be a problem here because I'm ending with the family was poor and it was a difficult life. So, what do we have now? Well, let's look at it. When I brainstormed my characters, I identified that main character, Peter. He was a young boy living on a farm with his parents. So I needed to introduce the boy at the beginning and give the reader some information about him. I know that many fairy tales begin with that phrase of once upon a time, so that's why I chose to start with it. I'm going to start that line, and then right after, I always want to introduce my main character, which is why I then did this next part of a young boy named Peter. I'm introducing that main character right after once upon a time. This beginning introduces Peter and provides information about the setting, which is what? He lives on a small farm a few miles from the king's castle. So there's my setting right there. So I'm going to highlight that in a different color. Agreed. So already in that first sentence, I have Peter and I have the setting. What else do you notice in this beginning sample paragraph? Well, I notice it talks about his family. So right there, we have more of the characters. It's telling me there's parents, and it's giving me some traits about them. They're kind and hardworking. It's also giving me this trait about Peter. He loved his parents. And it tells me that he's a helper. He enjoys helping them as much as he can. And notice now at the end, the conclusion of this introduction, what do I notice? The conclusion of my first paragraph is, I'm setting up a problem. I'm saying, hey look, there's going to be an issue here, and it's going to be related to his difficult life, and because he's poor. So by establishing that the family is poor and that life is difficult, I'm going to be setting up his desire to be a prince in that next paragraph. So how do you think I'm going to take this and now go to the next part? Well, remember, I'll go back and look at my example up here, and my next part should probably be about he sees a prince riding by the farm. I kind of established my characters, the setting, but I now need to do the beginning part in that problem. I need to introduce it. So what would my next paragraph be about? Well, it might be about the prince riding by. Because that's the next thing in here. I need to establish this problem. So, what might that paragraph look like? Well, let's give it a try. Remember, we have this dictation function that we can use as well, or we can handwrite it. So let's use this dictation function. One day, a prince rode by on his horse. with his royal entourage. Period. Peter looked at the prince and was very envious and jealous. Period. So here, I've introduced that problem. Now, I could keep going and add something like the cow, go straight into that talking cow, but remember, this is a fairy tale story, so I need dialogue. So I'm going to have Peter talk, and I'm going to have him say the other part, that he wants to be from a noble family so that he does not have to be poor. So remember, I need to use those quotation marks. Quotation marks. If I was from a noble family, like that prince, comma, all of my problems would be solved. Period. Now notice, it didn't do those quotation marks, so I'm going to have to go back and manually put them in. And then it did this funky thing with that capitalizing noble and prince, so we do always have to go back and edit. Now remember, we can't just put quotation marks here because I need that tag. Who's saying it and how they're saying it. So I'm going to put said Peter. Now this is my rough draft. Later on, when I come back, I'll probably want to get rid of that said and replace it with something a little better. But right now, I'm just going to get through and continue adding on. So what was the next thing that I have? Well, my next thing I have is the cow begins to talk to Peter at milking time. So I somehow need to connect this ending part with milking time. So it could be maybe his dad tells him Peter's time to milk the cow. It could be just that Peter's responsible and realizes he needs to go milk that cow. But I need to connect now this thinking to that cow. So think about that as you're doing your writing today. Remember, start with once upon a time and introduce those characters right away, which is what we have highlighted in yellow. Introduce that setting right away as well, and that problem, or set up the problem. Notice we crammed all of that in to our very first paragraph.